Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into, well, a really big one, the One Big Beautiful Bill, or OBBA. This piece of legislation, it just went through an absolutely wild ride in Congress. Think about this. Votes so close, they were basically razor thin in the House and the Senate, and it all came down to the vice president casting the deciding vote. Seriously dramatic stuff.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've gathered, a whole stack of sources. We've got legislative analysis, news reports, digging into the really fierce political arguments, plus economic forecasts from independent groups. Our goal here really is to cut through all that noise, all the headlines, and help you understand what this bill actually means, for the national debt, for healthcare, just the overall political scene. We want to find those nuggets of knowledge, those aha moments that you might miss in the day-to-day news.
Okay, so it just barely gets through the House. Then it needs the VP tiebreaker in the Senate. That tells me this thing isn't just controversial, it's like deeply splitting people. So what was in that first House version that kicked off such a fight? How did this bill, after kind of squeaking through the House, start to change shape as it headed to the Senate?
Well, it started as H.R. 1, introduced back on May 16th, 2025. It passed the House just days later, May 22nd, but look at the vote. 215 to 214. Super tight, almost entirely down party lines. And the House version was, well, huge. It aimed to make the 2017 Trump tax cuts permanent, but it also packed in these sweeping changes to healthcare, immigration, energy policy, and deficit spending. Just a massive bill.
Right, and they used a specific tactic, budget reconciliation. That was a big strategic move, wasn't it? For listeners maybe not totally, in the legislative weeds, why was using reconciliation so important here?
Oh, incredibly important.
Yeah.
Because it let them get around a potential filibuster in the Senate. That means they didn't need 60 votes, which is usually the threshold. They just needed a simple majority, 51 votes, which, given how slim their majority was pretty much essential to have any chance of passing it. Now, interestingly, the House version wanted to raise the debt ceiling by $4 trillion. But the Senate version, it upped the ante to $5 trillion. A $5 trillion increase. That right there set the stage for, well, more conflict.
5 trillion. Wow. And conflict seems like maybe an understatement given what came next. How did the Senate start, putting its own stamp on this bill in June? What kinds of changes did they start making?
Yeah, through June, the Senate Finance Committee really started kneading the dough, so to speak.
Yeah.
And it changed the flavor quite a bit. We saw amendments for deeper cuts to the Medicaid provider tax. Now, for listeners, that's a tax states put on healthcare providers, and they often use the revenue to get more federal matching funds for Medicaid. So cutting it sharply really reduces state flexibility in funding. They also pushed for the timeline for work requirements for people on Medicaid, tightened up those SALT caps, that's the state and local tax deduction limit, and they tweaked some things related to green energy policy too.
It's just fascinating how these tiny margins, especially in the Senate, really show these deep splits, sometimes even within the same party. Can you take us through that Senate climax, the vote-a-rama?
Oh, it was intense. The vote-a-rama session was this grueling, nonstop thing. It ran from June 30th straight into July 1st. And after all of that, the Senate managed to pass their amended version. But again, look at the vote. 51 to 50. Vice President J.D. Vance had to come in and cast the tie-breaking vote. It literally could not have been closer. Just highlights how shaky the ground was for this bill.
But the real fireworks, maybe the most revealing part, came from inside the Republican Party itself. And some unexpected people chiming in, too. Who were the key figures making waves, and what were they saying?
Yeah, one of the loudest voices, surprisingly from within the GOP, was Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina. And he didn't mince words. He publicly said, and this is a direct quote, "I'm telling the president, supporting the Senate mark will hurt people who are eligible and qualified for Medicaid." He got specific, too, warning his state, North Carolina, could lose something like $32 billion in federal Medicaid money over the next decade. That's a huge number.
And he didn't just stop at a warning, right? He made a pretty significant political move regarding his own career.
He did indeed. He called the White House's advice on the matter misinformed. And then, very publicly, he announced he wouldn't run for re-election. That signals some serious internal dissent, When a sitting senator basically says, "This bill is so bad, I'm willing to end my career over it," that really tells you something about the depth of the disagreement, or maybe the political risk he felt. It's more than just a vote, it's a statement.
And Tillis wasn't alone in the GOP opposition. Susan Collins from Maine, Rand Paul from Kentucky, they voted no, too. What were their main issues?
Well, Collins and Tillis, their main worry seemed to be the healthcare cuts. That was the common thread there. Rand Paul, though, came at it from a different angle. He felt the spending cuts in the bill were, in his words, weak and anemic. He was really concerned about the overall impact on the national debt. So different reasons, but they ended up on the same side for the vote.
Okay, but maybe the biggest surprise intervention came from completely outside politics. Elon Musk. What did he say, and how did President Trump take it?
Right, Elon Musk jumps in, the billionaire tech guy.
Yeah.
And he criticized the bill pretty vividly. He put out there, it is obvious with the insane spending of this bill, which increases the debt ceiling by a record $5 trillion, that we live in a one-party country, the Porky Pig Party. Time for a new political party that actually cares about the people. Strong words. And that led President Trump to threaten to basically chase Musk out of the country, back to South Africa, which, just added another layer of drama to the whole thing.
That Musk angle is really interesting, though. It kind of highlights the shift in the GOP, doesn't it? Musk sounds like that older school, traditional, fiscal, conservative Republican, worried about spending and debt. But Trump's focus, pushing for tax cuts while sort of avoiding cuts to big programs like Medicaid and Social Security that many working-class voters depend on, that marks a real change in the party's priorities. So this whole episode, it's not just about a piece of legislation. It really exposes this deep ideological crack opening up within the Republican Party. You've got the traditional fiscal conservatism clashing with this newer, populist, maybe even bigger spending approach.
Absolutely. And if we step back from the political fights for a second and just look at the policy itself, these specific changes, particularly in healthcare, they set a very clear path that would, really significantly impact millions of people's lives. The biggest single healthcare change in this Senate bill is probably the cut to federal Medicaid funding. We're talking nearly $1 trillion trimmed over 10 years.
Wait, nearly $1 trillion from federal Medicaid? That's just a staggering amount. Can you unpack what that actually means for people? Like those 11 million who might lose coverage. What does that look like day to day?
It's the biggest Medicaid rollback in, modern history. And yeah, the estimates are it puts over 11 million Americans at risk of losing their coverage by 2034. For a lot of those folks, that could mean losing access to their doctor, their medications, basic preventative checkups. It could mean having to skip needed treatments or ending up with huge medical bills, real, tangible impacts.
And on top of the funding cuts, the bill tightens work requirements for Medicaid. What does that involve? Who gets affected?
Right. So under this, adults who have children over 14 would need to meet an 80-hour-per-month work requirement to keep their benefits. Plus, there'd be more frequent income checks. And another significant change is removing undocumented immigrants from being eligible at all. So it changes both who can get it and what they have to do.
You mentioned some other health policies, too, sort of tucked in there.
Yeah, there are other pieces, things like bans on federal money going to gender-affirming care and also to Planned Parenthood services. And there are tighter rules around pharmacy benefit managers, PBMs, and how they handle drug pricing, which affects, the final cost of medications.
Wait, so connecting all these dots, what does this mean for you, the listener? For the national debt picture and for the country moving forward? Let's talk ripples, starting with the debt.
Well, the CBO, that's the Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan group that scores these things for Congress, they forecast the Senate bill, adds about $3.3 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. And another group, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, or CRFB, they think it could be even more, maybe up to $4 trillion once you factor in interest costs. That's roughly $1 trillion more added debt compared to the original House version.
It's so easy to get bogged down in these huge numbers, the trillions. But these are policies that hit people directly. Was there one specific impact or consequence that really jumped out at you from the sources?
What's really striking is how different the projections are. It's important we mention the White House sees it differently. They argue the bill will actually cut the debt by $1.4 trillion, mostly through savings and projected economic growth. They also expect more money coming in from new tariffs. But set against that are these independent estimates about coverage loss. Figures ranging between 11 and maybe even 17 million people potentially losing health insurance. That comes from the Medicaid changes, rollbacks to the Affordable Care Act, or ACA, and effects on people buying insurance without subsidies. That's a huge number of people potentially impacted.
Yeah, and you could see this hitting vulnerable groups hard, right? Maybe rural hospitals, too, which often rely heavily on Medicaid payments. They could face serious financial strain. Politically looking ahead, Senator Tillis bowing out, plus other moderates voting no. It definitely signals deeper splits in the GOP. That could really play out in the 2026 midterm elections.
Definitely. So what happens now? The Senate's version goes back to the House. They have to reconcile it, make it match their original bill somehow. Speaker Johnson, He's apparently urging them to make as few changes as possible. Why? Because big changes would mean it has to go back to the Senate for another vote. And given how close that last vote was, that's a risky proposition.
That won't be simple, right? You've got House moderates, especially lawmakers from rural areas where those Medicaid cuts could hit hard. They're likely to push back on Medicaid, on those salty cap changes we mentioned, on rolling back parts of the ACA. So it really sets up potentially some very tense negotiations in the conference committee where they try to iron out the differences. Plus, there's this looming deadline before the July 4th holiday. President Trump apparently wants to sign it before then. But whether they can actually bridge the gap between the Senate's pretty aggressive cuts and the House's position, well, it's still very much up in the air.
So yeah, we've tracked the OBBA's really dramatic journey. We've seen the potential pretty profound impacts on healthcare, on the national debt, and we've seen these deep political cracks it's exposed, particularly within the Republican Party itself.
It really leaves you thinking, given what the bill aimed to do, its stated goals, versus what these projections say about its actual fiscal impact, its social impact, what does this whole legislative process tell us about the real cost of political compromise? And, maybe more importantly, who ends up bearing that cost?